Great. So it's exactly 3 p.m. On Pacific time. So I think it's a good time to get started. And if people want to join, they can join whenever they want. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our Twitter space conversation around modern data architecture, emerging paradigms, and data mesh. So today I invited Zhamak Dehghani from ThoughtWorks, the creator of the data mesh concept, and Barr Moses, the founder and CEO of Monte Carlo Data Company. And Scott here will help record and try to record this conversation. So this is a disclaimer for you. Let me know if you can still hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Okay, great. So for those who haven't heard about the concept yet, I really encourage you to go to Martin Fowler blog and read data mesh articles by Zhamak, the source of truth about the paradigm. And I think for this discussion, let's start with a quick introduction. If you could just provide a quick introduction to yourselves, go around the room. Zhamak, do you want to start?
Sure, happy to. Hi, everyone. I'm Zhamak. I am acting as the head of emerging technologies for ThoughtWorks in North America. We are a global software consulting company that we build, various kinds of software for our clients. And I'm also the founder and creator of the concept of data mesh. So a lot of my time actually goes into elaborating on that, refining it, and working with our clients implementing it.
Great. We were just doing a quick introductions. So if you'd like to introduce yourself to the audience, that would be great.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Barr Moses. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Monte Carlo. We are a data reliability platform. So we help organizations become data-driven or adopt data by eliminating and reducing what we call data downtime. So we spend a lot of time helping organizations think about the organizational structure of their data teams and how to make the best use of that in order to actually use their data. And some of that starts with trusting the data. So looking forward to chatting about various architectures and the role of data mesh and all of that.
Great, thank you so much. And a brief intro to myself. I am a director of big data and analytics at Microsoft Azure, leading advocacy efforts, vision and strategy for product improvement, working with the community and customers to ensure that we're building exactly the technology they need for their architectures. And I think for this discussion, let's assume that the listeners come from different levels of familiarity and background. So it would be great to start by reviewing some of the general challenges many of the modern architectures suffer from today. So in your opinion, what are some of the common challenges in traditional or current approaches to data architecture?
I think when we say data architecture, that actually covers a lot of different concerns and areas. And generally speaking, the data architecture falls into the category of your operational data architecture, the OLTP systems and databases to keep the current state of the business. And on the other side, we have data architecture that covers the analytical access to the data, aggregate temporal immutable data views, and how machine learning or analytics can access the data. So I think we've got kind of these two camps of architecture. They need to be integrated and, of course, interconnected, but they still serve separate concerns. And I don't think we are really going into the OLTP side, but I just briefly say that I think we've been on the great track in terms of the patterns and architectural concerns that scale out, such as microservices, maintaining and keeping the state of their own databases and managing their schemas and their upgrades and providing APIs for access to data. So that's in the operational side of the data architecture. On the analytical architecture, I think the main challenge is that the existing solutions don't really scale out. And what do we mean by that? As the organizations grow, as they become more complex, as the environment becomes more volatile, the realities of today, really, the organizations struggle to get value from that data fast having the fast flow of value-driven, kind of data-driven value with continuous feedback. And that really the current architectures, the challenge with them is that they limit the agility in response to change. So if the data changes, if the new needs for data arises, we still have this kind of blocking solutions, or solutions that are fairly centralized, fairly disconnected from the business. They're not necessarily aligned with the technology and the operational side, and they become kind of, they hinder the organizational agility in getting value from data at scale when they grow. And just to note that the scale really doesn't mean, velocity or volume of the data. I think we've done amazing work in the technical architectural space to build solutions that manage a large volume of the data, can run, queries super fast and parallelize processing and so on. But what we failed to do is build technologies in a way that can scale out as your organization grows. But I'm curious what Barr sees, in working with our clients.
Yeah, 100% agree with all of the challenges that you've observed for sure. Some of the things that sort of we commonly hear from our customers and from folks, can be, sort of funny things like, I mean, they're not really funny, but they're sort of, painful and common to everyone. So I'm going to say like, okay, we have all this data, but what table should I actually be using? Or, there's a data asset and someone is asking like, whose data is this anyway? I understand that all of our data is here, but how do I even start and what should I actually use? All the way to actually like, hey, the data here looks wrong and I'm not even sure how to begin to figure out why and where. So I think there's a lot of questions around, data access and trust and discovery. And, sort of maybe one of the strongest symptoms that we see in terms of challenge is that there's this kind of one organization, one data team that just has this insanely long backlog of stuff that they need to do. And, if you want to make any change or make any progress, you just have to like wait for a year or two until like, the data team gets through their backlog. So oftentimes there are symptoms of an organization that is slowed down because of some of these challenges. And I think it really comes down at the end to the big shift that we've seen, which is data is distributed, but the way that we manage it and the way that we manage ourselves is not yet distributed. And that's what we need to overcome.
Amazing points. So yeah, it sounds like the data mesh paradigm strives to address some of the challenges that a lot of companies are experiencing, in particular around the bottlenecks in the organization, in the architecture, and also being proactive in preparing for growth and change. So at this point, we haven't yet introduced the concept. So if we were to share what exactly is a data mesh in a couple of sentences.
Couple of sentences.
I mean, we only have 15 minutes left.
There's a 4-series book that I can't wait for.
Yes.
Yeah, I give it a go. It's not going to be a couple of sentences, but it's I think data mesh is just a socio-technical shift and solution to the problems that we just talked about. It's a new approach in how we collect and manage and share analytical data. And if I had to reduce it and simplify it to these basic elements, there are 4 basic elements to it. I mean, I'm open to be challenged that these basic elements are not enough and we need more. But really, there's the element of organizational structure around that distributed, what Barr said, that, the data ownership, and then, of course, the architecture will get affected by how we own the data and manage the data. The ownership of the data being distributed and decentralized to people who are most apt and, suitable to control it, which is often business domains, right? The points of origin when the data comes from. So the first pillar is that the first element of data mesh is like, okay, organizationally, let's distribute the ownership to break this like big centralized team problem and large cognitive load problem apart, and then give those teams the long-term accountability and equip them with kind of product thinking to treat this data as a product. The problems that Barr mentioned, as in we don't know even where to get started. Who owns this data? Where is this? Can we trust it? I mean, we've solved these problems with consumer, product thinking, with API as a product thinking, and now we just have to extend it with data as a product, right? Thinking. So bringing quality, trustworthiness, and all of those kind of usability characteristics that make the data as a product to the teams, and then remove the cognitive loads of those teams by empowering them using a self-serve data infrastructure and addressing the new problems that may arise as in terms of lack of interoperability and inconsistencies and, you know, the overhead of actually the headache of governance in a decentralized fashion with a new model of governance in a federated fashion. Sorry, that was super long, but that's the best I could do.
No, that wasn't long, and I think I would argue that these 4 elements, even though, you know, as you mentioned, it's just 4, I think all of them are equally important, and the organizational aspect of it is, you know, very, very easy to skip. And this is one of the most important things that I think companies should be looking into first as well. So I think the next question would be, are there any patterns that you see in terms of the types of companies that are right candidates for applying or trying out data mesh for their architectures? I know we've talked about the challenges, but would you consider like large organizations that are moving fast to be like the main candidate for the data mesh architecture, or any other thoughts on that?
I think there is an axis of time, right? Your question needs to be contextualized to what are the right companies today, right, that they can adopt data mesh. And the reason that's important because any new solution or new innovation goes through this adoption curve of innovators and lead adopters pick it up first, and then the laggers and, you know, the large kind of portion of adopters later. And that matters because where we are today in terms of evolution of the data mesh is still fairly nascent. I mean, God knows how many Twitter fights or LinkedIn fights I occasionally get into. I don't want to, but you know that
you could write a book just about those, probably.
Probably, you know, that the technology solution providers said, look, we do data mesh, but we don't. The reality is we still have a fairly bit of a gap to follow and fill. But so I would say the organizations that data mesh makes sense to them today are the organizations that face the problem of scale that we've talked about. And also technologically, I guess, they're engineering focused, they're tech at core, they don't mind investing in the technology, building than buying, because not all the elements are available to buy. So there has to be this kind of combination of scale and tech at core characteristics, I would say. Barr, what do you think?
Yeah, definitely agree on. I love how you sort of phrase it kind of on the axis of time. And I think for companies, what we're seeing is sort of going through kind of a journey here. So, you know, they might start out as a small company with very basic needs for data. So they might have, you know, maybe one person in the data organization, or maybe 2 or 3. And obviously in those cases, you know, sort of the concept of distributed versus centralized, you know, has a different meaning. But sort of in the early days, I think there's some basic needs that companies sort of address, like, you know, basic reporting on your financials and basic reporting on, you know, ARR and revenues and all that stuff. Unless in many and more organizations, we see actually data as a product, as part of the company, a strategy actually. And in those organizations where their product really is their data, we actually see that really from the very, very early days of a company. I think I originally somewhere actually said that I think, you know, somewhere over 200 or so employees should start considering a data mesh. But I actually think I stand corrected. I think we're seeing data teams actually getting bigger earlier, and data is becoming more universal. And as a result, there needs to be an earlier movement around a self-serve, decentralized way to manage it, without basically reinventing the wheel. So I think we're seeing it definitely change over time, and also as there's a stronger understanding of what is actually a data mesh and how to apply some of the sort of microservices things that we've seen to the space of data.
Yeah, if I could give a litmus test, it would be if your organization feels a pain, if your data scientists, data analysts feel a pain around finding the right data and using it, and your innovation cycle is being slowed down because you can't go from a hypothesis around what if I can use this data in this way? What if there is a correlation between, you know, various facts to getting access to the data and validate or disprove that's a hypothesis? then you might be, the right candidate for looking into data mesh.
Absolutely agree. And to follow up on that topic of the pillars of data mesh, so it mentioned self-serve infrastructure platform as one of the pillars here. How do you see this aspect in data mesh differing from self-serve platforms for infrastructure management that are commonly implemented by large organizations currently? So basically, what would be some of the differences in terms of the scope and coverage of the self-serve infra platform in the data mesh here?
That's a really good question. I think it's one of those points of confusion about data mesh. If you look at majority of the self-serve data platforms that built today, who are they built for? They are built for that centralized data team, right? They're built for data specialists. They're built to make them go faster, and that giant backlog that Barr was referring to go through that backlog faster. So they're optimized for a different purpose. The data platform for data mesh is optimized differently. It's optimized to kind of give autonomy to those domain teams, to those generalist kind of technologies, to be able to now create data products, fully end-to-end, manage their data, and directly serve them peer-to-peer to their data consumers, the analysts and data scientists. So then we need a new set of capabilities. I call them kind of a data product experience plane being kind of a play on the mathematical plane concept, and it's a level of existence with clear kind of APIs that really remove friction and bring down the cognitive load of those data producers in a decentralized fashion. And then the other set of, so you need a set of capabilities to now not serve a centralized team that is just trying to optimize ingestion of data from all the corners of universe, because that's not your need anymore. Your need is to let data product developers who are decentralized, who are in the domains, or you don't have an army of data engineers embedded into those domains, those generalists be able to produce trustworthy kind of high quality data products. And then having a mesh or a distributed now set of kind of data products raises a set of concerns that need to be addressed, like how, and this is where kind of Barr, I think, can jump in, is that how I'm going to actually govern this data or measure the quality or observe this data in a distributed fashion. So there's a set of capabilities, I call them mesh experience plane, which is the mesh level concerns, like the semantic correlation of the data in a decentralized fashion, so I can join this observability of the lineage of the data, so I can kind of see where it comes from. And those capabilities need to work in a decentralized fashion. But nevertheless, I think both of these planes, the data product kind of experience plane, data mesh experience plane, they're building upon existing technologies that existing self-serve platforms kind of support, right? The storage and the compute and access control. And I call that kind of our utility plane. So we will be building upon it, but optimize it for a different setup and a different set of users.
This makes sense. Barr, do you have any additional thoughts on the self-serve platform experience in the data mesh?
No, I think Zhamak did a great job explaining how that works. So yeah.
Great. And I think we will talk about the data quality in just a little bit. This is a really important topic that you just brought up. But I wanted to talk about the decentralized data ownership first. So some technicians are wondering if this concept of decentralized data ownership, it overlaps with the concept of data virtualization. And others are curious if this means that each data product team manages their own separate data stores with the data. So there is a lot of confusion in that area as well. What are some of the good examples of the approaches that you see for decentralized data ownership in the implementations that you have seen?
Yeah, I think this is also another awesome question. And as you said, it's a point of confusion. So let me just maybe clarify one thing, is that data mesh is a logical architecture, And it is somewhat the concerns we're talking about in terms of physically data being co-located, or, those are physical layer concerns. And these are orthogonal concerns. Of course, there's a relationship between them, but these are separate concerns. So for example, the data mesh would say that I want from a data product developer experience to have to have autonomy, as in I need to have all of the structural elements. I need to have the storage and compute and query system and all of the things that allow me to serve my data to data scientists. But that doesn't mean that you have to now have your own separated geolocation, separated, in your data storage layer. In fact, if the mesh is just an inter-organization setup with, I don't know, one cloud provider, you probably wouldn't do that. And you might have a single storage layer. However, there are independent schemas, there are independent access right management, there are independent tenancy model that allows the data product to be deployed in autonomous fashion. So I just want to clarify the logical experience of building and serving a data product from the physical storage of where things live. Those are orthogonal concerns. But then going back to your question of, okay, so I've got, let's talk about virtualization. I think virtualization probably means many different things, but I tell you the definition that I'm most familiar with, or there are probably other flavors of it. But usually virtualization sits on top of, if they sit on top of your OLTP systems, databases, like your microservices or operational databases, and expose that data as is, or maybe with some minor transformation externally, that probably is not a good idea. Whether it's a data mesh or an API based, it's probably not a good idea, because you're exposing kind of your data on the inside, internal implementation, a database that has been optimized for a transactional purpose. Now try to expose it as for analytical purposes. And analytical, like predictive analytics or historical trend modeling, these require a very different view of the data. So I would say perhaps if you want to use virtualization in terms of giving different modes of access to the same data on top of your data products, which are different from your operational databases, perhaps. I haven't used that in anger to make a comment, but if you think about using virtualization on top of your microservices databases and expose them and call that a mesh, that is probably a really bad idea. You're creating pathological tight coupling between between the operational system that wasn't defined to be exposed. On the federated query, I think those technologies are definitely needed, because once you have decentralized evolution of the data, right, independently of each other, and you've also isolated or decoupled the schemas and the semantic definition of the data for this data product independently, as in their model differently, independently, their model goes through the life cycle independently. You have to have a way of running queries in a federated fashion on those, and you don't necessarily require to pull all the data down to the consumers so that you can process it. So in many cases, you actually want to push the compute up to the producer to just get the data that you need. And that's where the federated query systems come to play. Again, I think we still have to improve upon to really grasp the kind of apply that in the data mesh, and probably some reconfiguration need to happen, but those are more aligned. Hopefully I answered cleared out some of the confusion.
Yes. I think the biggest danger that I see in the data mesh is the way people can misunderstand it, even though it's a really awesome concept, really useful for so many organizations. I think like what we're doing right now, clarifying questions like this, would really help companies avoid certain mistakes. And these questions are based on the discussions that I've seen happening within the companies who are considering it. So hopefully they can be on the right path to thinking about the right implementation here. And the great topic of data quality, this is another of ideas that data mesh advocates for and encourages. So data quality is a pretty big concept. So maybe we can decompose it and help people understand what exactly data quality means.
Yeah, I'm happy to start, but would love to hear Zhamak's take on this as well. I think actually sort of the intersection of, what we'd call data quality or data observability and data mesh is one of the more interesting areas. So just to take a step back for a second, I think, in the previous world where you didn't have a data mesh, where data mesh, potentially, might not even be part of your future, you really typically had a very simplified data architecture, and you really only cared about data quality upon ingestion. And you sort of the good old sentence like, garbage in, garbage out. And so it was really important that you make sure that whatever data you ingesting is really clean, so that when you're sort of using it in your data products or in your decisions, you can trust it. The world has changed very much from there. And in the last sort of 5 to 10 years, the architecture and the systems that we're working with are way more complex. And, if you think about sort of a data pipeline, all the way from ingestion through transformation of the data lakes, data warehouses, ETLs, BIs, ML models, there's so many different components that you can no longer think about data quality as only sort of a point of time, maybe upon ingestion or something like that. And I think in the same way that sort of the data mesh kind of dictates this end-to-end thinking and this distributed understanding with domain-specific ownership of data, I actually think we have to think about data quality in that same way. And I think that's where we sort of introduce the concept of data observability, and where in order to actually generate sort of the outcome that we're all after, which is, having access to trusted data, we actually have to totally rethink how we've been talking about and have been thinking about data quality, and think about it as not garbage in, garbage out, but rather something that provides us visibility end to end to really trust your data. And so when we think about sort of data quality, sort of the ability to answer these questions like, when was this table last updated, and who owns this table, and are they using it, and is all the data sources that feed this table, are they also up to date, and am I getting the right number of rows or the right volume of data that I expect? Is this still sort of in the same structure? Are all the fields that I'm relying on to make this, to write this formula to calculate this number in this dashboard that we're using for our marketing campaign, is everything really truly end to end, on time and reliable that we can actually use? And so data observability is actually a concept that borrows from the concepts of observability in DevOps. And so in DevOps and software engineering, it's very well understood what observability actually means, and how to use observability in the context of achieving uptime and reliable infrastructure and applications. And so in the same way that we can take sort of concepts from engineering and apply them to data, we're taking the concept of observability and applying that to the health of your data here. And so the idea is that if you are trying to implement a data mesh in your organization, it's really hard to do that without actually empowering your end users with the ability to also know whether you can trust the data. And so data observability is actually part of that, is the ability to let your end users, your consumers, be able to answer those questions in a more sort of reliable and standardized approach.
And also, I think that a lot of challenges come from the fact that we have some tools that are mostly specialized in one specific system, and they're pretty static. So they're focused on some static analysis. But the nature of today's data is very dynamic, and it's changing so quickly. So it's hard to find good tools that can keep up with that. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, certainly. So, if there's something that's like really sort of happening at the data space, sort of the amount of change, right? So it's actually like at a palpable rate, right? Is how the industry is moving. And if there's one thing that's sort of remaining constant in the data space, is kind of the concepts of change. And so I think the tools and the platforms that we use to manage our data have to adapt and to change at the same rate or faster, honestly. And so, if I'm sort of a data engineer or leading a data engineering team or a data analyst or data scientist, I need to stay on top of so many tools and so many solutions. It's sometimes pretty daunting, right? But I think when it comes back to sort of what do I actually need to solve and when, I think thinking about sort of tools and solutions that adopt that approach that we just talked about, so thinking about end-to-end coverage, right? So to your point, not something that sort of works with only one system or that's not dynamic enough to change, to something that does provide that end-to-end observability. I think the second important part is that it has to be automation and machine learning first. I think a lot of sort of the solutions that we're seeing or that we've used in the data industry more historically are very manual. Honestly, lots of the things that we've done have literally been sort of depending on human beings, checking numbers or writing custom SQL checks or, lots of various kind of ad hoc solutions like that. And so I think a move to automation and machine learning first is really important. And, sort of the need to kind of facilitate, access and discovery and quality across the board, which actually applies the data mesh's universal standardization layer for things like governance and quality and access and all that good stuff.
And with that, I think once we found out and analyzed and saw that the data is high quality or low quality, I think another thing that is important to think about is how do we trace back to the cause of what actually happened with the data and how did it come around to be this way. And this maps to the concept that you mentioned, data lineage, that Zhamak also mentions in her data mesh articles as well. So this is a really interesting area. Zhamak, do you have any thoughts on that as well?
Sure. I think I want to double down on one thing that Barr mentioned a few times, which in her kind of explanation, which is trust. I think the root of definition of quality is that does the user trust and can the user trust the data, which means does the data is the data business truthful. Does it truthfully represent the business facts? And if it doesn't, can we articulate how it doesn't reflect that with SLOs, right? I mean, there is so much prior art that exists already in the operational space that we can kind of adopt and adapt them to the data space. So lineage, the concept of tracing and open tracing has always existed in the operational system. We kind of need to bring it and adapt it to the world of data because it does look different. The concept of setting expectations with the SLOs and defining, okay, what is the expected behavior of this data in terms of its integrity, in terms of missing volume, in terms of timeliness, and be able to articulate and communicate that and then kind of broadcast it to the whole network and be able to monitor it needs to be. And I really hope that, and on the lineage side and on the kind of metric side and SLO side, I really hope that the same evolution that we saw in the operational world that, we started with our own ad hoc structured logging, which was a thing like we already do as a good software engineering practice, have developed some standards, some open standards that we can convey these kind of quality metrics or representative of quality or trust metrics, traces, lineage in a standardized fashion and kind of create a healthy ecosystem of tooling on top of it. So that was a little wink, wink, nudge, nudge to Barr, by the way, there.
You also mentioned the importance of communication about this, and this brings us to another interesting topic of organizations embracing data mesh. And there are a lot of questions around how do people get started with this in case there is someone in the company that needs to approve the decision. What would be the right path to start advocating for it within an organization? Do you see, can one technical person be the start of that? Or do you see that people in the positions of a CTO, CIO need to be the drivers of the organizational transformation here? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I hope it was the case that it could be totally grassroots and one engineer could sneak in data mesh into the organization. But unfortunately, right now, I don't think that's a realistic expectation. I think data and all the data-driven initiatives and data platform investments are so highly visible and so highly political in organizations, especially large organizations, that this has to be a top-down. There has to be a top-down support for it and a top-down evangelism. So again, looking at existing organizational structures where everything about data falls under CDO, and hopefully a CDO or CDAO, that Chief Digital Analytics Officer, that reports directly to CEO, which is also in itself telling, which means, your organization wholeheartedly has actually embraced becoming data-driven, because if they report to CIO, it might tell a different story, or CFO, even worse. But in those cases, I think that CDO or CDAO would be the right person to kind of start pushing this forward. Ideally, the domains get aligned very quickly. We work with organizations that they have a fantastic support directly from CEO, CDAO. And guess what happens? We have a great movement and momentum behind the technical implementation of it, but the domains are not on board. So all you're doing is a lot of over-engineering of distributing data among who? Still a centralized data team, right? So that definitely, you don't want that happen. So you want to have the onboarding of the domains, get 1 or 2 or 3 domains that are aligned with the vision and push that forward. And we see that with some of our clients, in fact, that, we see this coming from the domain itself, like they're in a particular manufacturing part of the business or the pharmaceutical part of the business, and they are pushing this forward and bringing the infrastructure folks. The infrastructure has such a crucial role in this, so they need to be on board. So it certainly has to have a top-down support, has to have the domain engagements early on, so it needs to come at that level, have that level of business support. And what we found is that actually the practitioners and engineers are not the difficult ones to convince. Those are the guys who really embrace this, because they're feeling the pain, right? They're feeling the challenges. And so a bit of both, right? Grassroots, top-down, definitely top-down is a big element of it.
I totally agree on sort of the difficulty of this kind of being with the people and the organization. I was sort of laughing to myself when you said, we're sort of over-engineering a lot of things in this centralized platform, but how do we actually get adoption? And I think, we'll totally agree that sort of what we see is a lot of the challenges around sort of getting buy-in and actually just driving change in organization is really hard. And we've seen that also in the move from monolithic to microservices, right? Like those migrations are also really hard and painful. So I'm hoping that we can learn from that. I think some of the good things is that actually these changes can bring upon a lot of resolution to areas where there's historically friction between groups. So for example, we very, very often see a common tension point between consumers of data and upstream producers of data, because many times, if you have like an engineering team that's responsible for pipelines, and then maybe you have a data engineering downstream, and then analysts downstream that are actually consuming the data, oftentimes analysts will come sort of knocking on the door of the data engineering and be like, hey, what's going on? Can we get this? Can we use this? What's going on here? What's going on that? And there's this like blaming game where every group is basically like blaming the next group upstream. And there's this like, finger pointing game that ends up happening. And actually, if you sort of think about different organizational structures like data mesh, that actually allows for sort of, liberty, if you will, or kind of, autonomy of the right kind of autonomy, and the right discussion around what's important, what are the standards that we care about, that we want to enable everyone to have, but then what also should each domain own? And I think those discussions are way, way healthier. So I'm actually hoping that, we sort of, from the tension, something great, some magic will be created. And just, to kind of double click into something that Zhamak mentioned before around kind of developing these open standards for trust metrics, 100% agree. I think as part of also making this organizational change is figuring out sort of what are the metrics of success and how do you actually measure, I don't know if the ROI, but what does awesome look like for your organization? And, maybe that comes down to measuring trust or time to insights, or, it could be of various different things, but figuring out what those metrics are, what's the bottom line that you're trying to improve, I think can help get more people on board, whether it's, more grassroots or top down, probably both, to Zhamak's point, but aligning everyone across a shared outcome that we want to get. Like, we want 90% of our decisions to be data driven. That's like something that one of our customers, Colibri Games, actually going to be speaking about this. Is sort of driving to, or we want time to insight to be less than an hour. Those are the kind of things where people can rally around, and I think those can help accelerate some of those challenges.
Yeah, and I know you mentioned this is change and this is transformation, and I totally agree. I mean, when we start working with our clients, we really treat this as a digital as part of your digital transformation. And I know it's one of those overused words, and I roll my eyes when other people say digital transformation, but it truly is. Like, if you have all these digital touch points that are generating data, and you want to optimize your digital services with ML and augmented kind of intelligence, then as part of that transformation, it's not just about putting digital facades in front of your existing services, but also fix the way you manage data as well. So I think it's in the same kind of, in the vicinity of the similar types of transformation. I think it's the last wall that we need to bring down. We have brought down the dev and the ops wall and other kinds of walls. I think it's the data and the dev and other walls around the data that we've put in. So I think it's really a transformation for that to happen. And practitioners need to be on board. Practitioners need to have the right tools to be able to really do that end to end. Like that data scientist, the data analyst that you mentioned comes and knocks on the data engineer door. They should be able to easily to just discover from the mesh what's available. It's a high quality data product. It's not just some table sitting somewhere on disk. You can see the metrics, you can see where it's coming from, you can see the owners of it, and there's good documentation around it. You can kind of use it, so you don't. Hopefully, we can remove those kind of walls and allow peer-to-peer collaboration in a faster and less frictionful fashion.
And as a part of that digital transformation, there's probably also a transformation of like budget or cost ownership, because in the standard data architectures, like things were organized the way people are already used to. But with the decentralized data ownership, there will be some domain teams focused on a specific area, but then there might be some domain teams serving other teams. And there might be some questions around who should own the budget for that. And I guess we already talked about that the decision to adopt data mesh should be done by the CTO organization and be driven by them. So the discussions around budget and costs should probably also happen early on. Any thoughts on that?
I think the decision is a collaborative decision. If domains and business domains are not on board, or business aligned tech domains, let's say, are not on board, this is not going to fly. But you're right that in terms of the charging model, I mean, we've seen this. There's prior art, right? We've seen this with APIs. When the organizations move to microservices, there might be a very popular microservice in the organization that manages customer, kind of APIs that all the other domains want to use. And there is sometimes a chargeback mechanism that say, well, you can use this microservice, but if you use it with this number of times or this such frequency, you will pay for it. So I think the same concept will kind of exist, that people would use other people's data, other domains' data, and there might be a charge for using it in a way that they didn't intend it to be used, or to the scale that didn't intend it to scale. So those models could evolve. But I think the budget allocated to the platform is definitely necessary. Sometimes what we find is that the platform tries to piggyback on the budget of a business initiative, right? So you have a business initiative, you want to do some sort of a optimization of your customer onboarding, let's say, and you have some business projects running to do that. And then you want to kind of piggyback the build out of your platform, data mesh platform, onto those budgets. And that's definitely not going to work. So recognition of the platform, that the city organization needs to, often infrastructure folks need to build that, right? That need to build that and have the allocated budget for that, I think has to be there. Otherwise, this is really not going to work, because the level of attention that you need to build this kind of new types of platform, particularly today, right? Because you can't just simply buy it or rent it, would need its own budgeting.
Yeah, and I think maybe one of the most interesting or positive trends that you actually alluded to earlier, Zhamak, is kind of data teams oftentimes uniting together, sort of with a chief data officer or head of data or something like that. That is more and more reporting to the CEO, and I think that speaks to the elevated importance of the data organization today and increased power of this organization. And with that comes, obviously increased investment. And so I think that's just a general trend that sort of supports a lot of what we're saying, and hopefully kind of continue to see more of.
Yeah, and some of that budget get dispersed, right? Because some of that still will stay with the data organization, but if the domain organizations that had already, if they were down the path of microservices type architectures, they had already aligned business and tech to a degree. Now they're aligning business, tech, and data. So they to get that ownership and have the accountability for managing their data, they probably need now some new resources. Of course, they're using the platform, but it still would have additional kind of that budget gets probably decentralized as well. But I think the interesting models will evolve. I don't have a good handle of that yet.
Touched upon the topic where we talked about the change that needs to happen, and obviously we can't just take all of the existing technologies that we use right now and make a data mesh out of it. So I guess another interesting discussion here is what are some of the important qualities of certain technologies that they need to have to be useful in a data mesh. I know we talked about open standards, open protocols, things like granular access control, workload sharing. So maybe we can discuss some of these aspects and what qualities the technology needs to have to be beneficial.
Can I just start by saying that you are a wonderful facilitator. Thank you for not asking us to call out the technologies
+1.
Yeah. I think, as you said, any decentralized technology, right, from the birth of internet to cloud to microservices, like these technologies that by nature are decentralized, they have to work in a kind of interoperable, standard-driven, protocol-driven fashion, right? That you can have small pieces that do one thing and one thing really well, but it can easily get reconfigured and composed with other technologies. So what's the example of that? So if you are using, let's say, an existing storage layer, and let's say for every data product, because data products by nature are domain-oriented and not tech-oriented, every data product might expose the data in different modes of access. So you can have data product that exposes data in a file-based object store type access, as well as a tabular relational SQL, queryable, I guess, mode of access. And for that, we might say, okay, existing lake storage technologies, S3 or ADLS or other technologies, they can be easily used and configured. Well, actually, I removed the word easily because there are some challenges to those today, because they never imagined somebody use them in the scale that we are using them. But they can configured. Why they can be configured? Because there is a unique addressable endpoint that is API driven, and you can use that addressable endpoint or API to configure it, to provision it, to get access. What are the challenges that sometimes it doesn't lend that technology to be used in a data product? Well, the access control doesn't support any existing kind of standards-based access model using, the auth or JOT tokens or certificates. Like all of these technologies already exist for, let's say, authentication. And you have to use the account management or access control that is baked to that proprietary version of that storage layer. So the more we think about this as utilities that we can compose them and in new ways, and those utilities don't restrict us to, well, you can have this, let's say ADLS, or sorry, I didn't want to exactly mention technologies, but storage layer, let's say, but you can, if you don't put restrictions on, you can have 50 of those. not 100 or not 200, because now we want to configure them in a decentralized fashion. We will have many instances of those. We need a tenancy model, right? That it lends itself to that distribution. So I think that those technologies work really well. What doesn't work well which is, I think a lot of data technologies these days work that way, and it's just a representative of the maturity of that technology where we are, because it's still relatively new, is that when these technologies see themselves as the center of the universe, they don't integrate well through APIs, they don't have a good tenancy model, they don't give you like multiple namespaces or some way of a data product control. The technology wants to control, right? And really they get in the way of what people actually need to do, which is providing data. So most of your time is dealt with operating the technology than actually using the technology. They would require a centralized monolithic kind of canonical model. You need to have one giant schema. So those type of technologies would be really hard to utilize. Barr, what do you think there?
I agree. I think, I mean, you know, what I think as sort of as a person, you know, sort of a data kind of person, practitioner, you know, trying to navigate the world of different solutions and tools today, it is pretty complex. And I think you're right. I think if we sort of think of this as sort of an ecosystem where we have interoperability and we have basically like playing nice with each other, right? That's really going to benefit all of us. I don't think that there's going to be sort of a consolidation into like one omnipresent platform or something like that. And so, you know, a lot of sort of the concepts you talked about really resonate. So API-based systems and systems that think about this end-to-end ability. So, you know, not necessarily work with one system or one kind of static state, but rather, systems that take into account sort of the dynamic nature of data. I think people want sort of the ability to customize and to, adapt the technologies to their own needs because they're changing so much. And, you know, new data sources are being added every day, new team members come and leave. And so, you know, thinking through how do we build something that we can actually take into the future is really important. And, you know, underlying that is, I think a couple of important things are just like best practices, but obviously like highly secure, right? Data is kind of at the core of everything that we do. And so security and reliability and scalability has to be top of mind for everything. I think the other thing that's been overlooked is actually solutions that drive automation first. It's kind of crazy to me, but really so many of kind of the best practices that we have today are just kind of like, you know, forgot that there's like automation or, we sort of kind of neglected that in a way as an industry, right? And so I think kind of double clicking into that would help everyone and kind of move us forward. Zhamak, did you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think I totally agree. Like automate. If I need to go click a GUI or, you know, have manually intervene to get this data or data product, because data product has code and data in itself, like deployed, up and running, and it requires that kind of manual, non-repeatable and non-reliable intervention. I think that technology would be really damaging because now you had one problem, which was like one data center or data lake. Now you will have many data products problems, right? That problem exponentially grows there. I think there is an analogous situation, right? I'm not that old. Probably people are. I'm old, but probably I wish I was older to go back in time and see how many times this has happened to us, right? But at least I can go back to 2011, 2012 when microservices came to exist, right? We had these aspirations that transcended the technology that was available today, right? The service-oriented architecture were around for a while, and then we had aspirations around microservices, but the technology were fairly monolithic, right? We had the web spheres of the world, we had these giant application servers, and guess what? While they could, in spirit, right, support some sort of a decentralized service-oriented architecture, in practice they couldn't. Every time you deployed the service, like the whole thing got destabilized, had to go up or down, and dependencies through libraries exist. Like we've been through this. So, and then what happened was that over time, the technology disappeared. With the technology became secondary, and what really became and disappeared from the scene, as in it went behind the scenes. So when we really started writing microservices, all we cared about was the logic, that little business logic of that service in our language of choice. And yes, we'd use lightweight frameworks to build that, but it wasn't this like technology sitting right in front of our face that we had to deal with that to then write and deploy our microservices. So I really hope that a technology disappears. Like the next generation data companies are the ones that should wear a badge of pride if they say our technology actually is not, like, you don't have to deal with our technology directly as a data product developer. You just write your own little code or you just deal with the data itself and don't worry about the technology getting in your way.
This is a really important point. Another thing that I really like about data mesh is I guess the more companies start adopting it, a lot of vendors and other organizations, they will start prioritizing some of the features in their technology that are required for a successful data mesh implementation because there is demand. And those features are things like automation, interoperability, open standards. So I think that even those companies who are not directly using data mesh or implementing data mesh, they could still benefit from the positive change that data mesh has started driving in the industry. So thanks to Zhamak. And I really like the concept of what it advocates for. And we have just a couple of minutes left. So maybe it could be a good idea to ask the audience for like one small question, if someone wants to go ahead. This is your chance. Zhamak and Barr are here to answer the question.
Can the audience speak? Do they have the ability to speak?
Yes, they have the ability to request to speak.
Okay.
If there isn't a question, I can ask Zhamak a question, but I guess we'll give folks another minute. But if not, I have a question.
Go ahead. And if somebody requests it, I'll just grant them access after your question.
Okay, awesome. So I'll ask Zhamak, what do you wish for data mesh for the next year? Like if you had a magic wand, you could do whatever you want. What would that be?
Oh, this is so. I have a long wish list. Can I just pick one? I'll pick two. I think I really hope to see, and I will definitely take some steps to make it happen. I want to see open foundation coming together and kind of open source projects still coming to exist under that kind of the guidance of or framework of data mesh. I really want to create a space for open contribution. And of course, the world is not all open. We all have to make money somehow. So those open solutions can have turnkey commercial, solutions always behind them. So what I wish for, really a set of new open standards and open specifications that act as the glue between all of these capabilities that we talk about, right? Adoption, I think adoption is already happening. Hopefully we won't have many failure cases to deter people, but collaboration of the industry, let's set some examples with people coming forward, not just trying to resell the same products under the label or banner of data mesh, but stepping up and showing some of those, creating the standards that allow this decentralized model to work. That would be my wish.
Love it.
So there were a lot of hints in there for you, Barr.
We're on it.
Good. Looking forward to it.
So I guess we don't have any requests for questions. So hopefully this was useful to people, and hopefully the recording worked, and we can publish this in the Data Mesh Learning meetup group. I think that's what it's called. And I would also encourage people to join the Slack. There is a vendor neutral Slack called Data Mesh Learning, and you can go to the Twitter profile and get the link for that. So I really thank both Barr and Zhamak for joining this conversation. And yeah, let's stay connected and chat about data mesh on Twitter.